When you flick the switch, you probably don't think about who owns the electrons. But the answer is far from simple. Australia's electricity system is a patchwork of foreign giants, state governments, super funds, and local companies. This is the story of who really controls the power that runs the country. Chapter 1: The Changing Grid. Australia's electricity system was built for a different era. In the 1950s and 60s, state governments built massive coal-fired power stations near coalfields. They strung high-voltage transmission lines to cities and towns. It was a simple, centralized model: burn coal, spin a turbine, send power down the line. That system worked for decades. But now, it's being dismantled and rebuilt. Coal plants are closing. In their place, wind farms and solar fields are sprouting across the countryside. Batteries are being bolted onto the grid. Transmission lines are being upgraded and extended. This transition is enormous. It involves hundreds of billions of dollars. And where does that money come from? Increasingly, from overseas. But before we get to the foreign money, we need to understand the scale of the change. In 2023, coal still supplied about 46% of Australia's electricity. By 2030, that could drop to under 20%. The retirement of coal plants is accelerating. Liddell closed in 2023. Yallourn is set to close in 2028. Eraring, the biggest coal plant in the country, is scheduled to close in 2025. That's a lot of capacity to replace. And the new capacity isn't coming from Australian companies alone. It's coming from global energy giants, infrastructure funds, and even sovereign wealth funds. They see Australia as a prime investment. Why? Because we have some of the best solar and wind resources in the world. And because our electricity market is stable and well-regulated. But that stability is about to be tested. The grid is changing faster than anyone predicted. And the question of who owns it is becoming more urgent by the day. Chapter 2: 10 Cracks in the System. Here's a number that might surprise you. Australia's electricity market is one of the most complex in the world. It's a patchwork of state and federal rules, spot markets, and regulated networks. But underneath that complexity, there are 10 major problems. First, the transition is happening faster than the grid can handle. Second, transmission lines take years to build, but we need them now. Third, wind and solar are variable. The sun doesn't always shine, and the wind doesn't always blow. Fourth, prices are still a major concern. Households and businesses are feeling the pinch. Fifth, coal plants are retiring, and replacement capacity isn't always ready on time. Sixth, energy policy is a political football. Every election brings new targets and new rules. Seventh, the market structure is so complicated that even experts struggle to predict outcomes. Eighth, renewable energy is being curtailed because the grid can't absorb it all. Ninth, we need massive amounts of storage, but batteries and pumped hydro are still expensive. And 10th, the whole rebuild requires enormous amounts of capital, labor, and infrastructure. That's the backdrop. Let's look at who's actually paying for all this. And who's going to profit. Because the problems aren't just technical. They're financial. And the money is flowing from all over the world. Chapter 3: Investment versus Ownership. Before we go any further, we need to clear up a confusion. It's easy to say foreign companies own Australia's power. But that's not always true. There's a difference between foreign investment and foreign ownership. Investment means putting money into something. Ownership means controlling it. For example, a foreign pension fund might buy a 10% stake in an Australian power company. That's investment. But they don't control the company. On the other hand, a foreign company might buy 100% of an Australian power station. That's ownership. And then there's control. A company can own 50% of a joint venture, but have operational control. That's a gray area. So when we talk about who owns Australia's power, we need to be precise. We need to trace the ownership chain. For every major electricity company, we need to ask, who is the ultimate parent? And where are they based? This isn't just an academic exercise. It determines who makes decisions, who takes profits, and who bears risk. And it's not always clear. For example, AGL is an Australian company, but it's publicly listed. That means anyone can buy shares, including foreigners. So technically, AGL is partly foreign-owned. But it's still Australian-controlled. The same goes for Origin Energy. So when we say Australian-owned, we need to be careful. We mean Australian-controlled, not necessarily 100% Australian-owned. This distinction is crucial. And it's the key to understanding the whole picture. Chapter 4, Energy Australia, the Hong Kong Connection. Let's start with a name you'll recognize, Energy Australia. It's one of the big three electricity retailers. But did you know that Energy Australia is actually owned by a Hong Kong company? That's right. The parent company is CLP Holdings, based in Hong Kong. CLP is one of the largest electricity companies in Asia. And it's been in Australia since 2000. Energy Australia owns a mix of generation assets. There's Yallourn, a coal-fired power station in Victoria's Latrobe Valley. It's over 50 years old and produces about 1,480 megawatts. Then there's Mp Piper, a coal plant in New South Wales, with 1,400 megawatts. And there's Tallawarra, a gas-fired plant in NSW, with 435 megawatts. Plus Newport, a gas plant in Victoria, with 500 megawatts. But here's the thing, these are all owned by CLP. So when you pay your Energy Australia bill, a portion of that money eventually flows to Hong Kong. Now, is that a problem? Not necessarily. CLP is a well-established company. It's not a hostile foreign power. But it does mean that a critical piece of Australia's electricity infrastructure is controlled from overseas. And that raises questions about accountability. If there's a supply crisis, who makes the decisions? The local management or the board in Hong Kong? And what about profits? CLP expects a return on its investment. That's normal. But it also means that Australian electricity consumers are helping to fund a Hong Kong company. That's a fact. And it's worth remembering. Chapter 5, Alinta Energy, from Australian icon to Hong Kong giant. Alinta Energy is another name you might know. It started as a Western Australian state-owned utility. It was privatised in the 1990s. And it went through a series of owners. Then, in 2017, it was bought by Chow Tai Fook Enterprises, a conglomerate based in Hong Kong. So Alinta is now foreign-owned. What does Alinta own? It has Loy Yang B, a coal-fired power station in Victoria. That's 1,000 megawatts. It also has a bunch of gas plants, including Newman and Port Hedland in Western Australia. And it's been building renewable projects. So Alinta is a major player. But its ultimate owner is in Hong Kong. Now, here's an interesting twist. Alinta's CEO, Jeff Dimery, is Australian. The company is headquartered in Sydney. It employs thousands of Australians. So on the surface, it looks Australian. But the ownership is foreign. This is a common pattern. A foreign company buys an Australian business, keeps the local branding, and runs it from afar. That's not necessarily bad. But it does mean that strategic decisions are made overseas. For example, when Alinta decided to close Loy Yang B early, that decision was made in Hong Kong. It wasn't made by the Australian government. It wasn't made by the workers. It was made by a corporate board on the other side of the world. And that's a sobering thought. Chapter 6, EDL, Powering the Outback. Now let's go to the Outback. You've probably never heard of EDL. But they run power stations in some of the most remote parts of Australia. EDL stands for Energy Developments Limited. It's a global company based in Australia, but it's owned by New Fortress Energy, an American company. EDL specializes in off-grid and remote power. They provide electricity to mines, communities, and industrial sites that aren't connected to the main grid. For example, they power Barrow Island, off the coast of Western Australia. That's a massive oil and gas operation. They also power Newman, a mining town in the Pilbara. And they run hybrid systems that combine solar, wind, and gas. In many cases, they're the only source of power for hundreds of kilometers. So EDL is critical to Australia's mining industry. But they're owned by an American company. That means a significant part of Australia's remote energy infrastructure is controlled from the United States. Now, does that matter? Well, if there's a power outage at a mine, who do they call? They call EDL's operations center, which might be in Perth or Brisbane. But the ultimate decision makers are in the US. And that's a concern for some. Because energy security isn't just about the cities. It's about the mines that produce our minerals. And those mines depend on foreign-owned power. Chapter 7, Neoen and the Battery Revolution. You might have heard of the Hornsdale Power Reserve. It's the big battery in South Australia that made headlines around the world. It was built by Neoen, a French company. Neoen is one of the biggest renewable developers in Australia. They own wind farms, solar farms, and batteries. For example, they own the Western Downs Green Power Hub in Queensland. That's a massive solar farm with 400 megawatts. And they're building the Goyder South Wind Farm in South Australia, which will be even bigger. Plus, they've got the Collie Battery in Western Australia. So Neoen is a major player in Australia's renewable transition. But they're not Australian. They're French. Now, does that matter? Well, Neoen is a private company. It's not listed on the stock exchange. So it's not easy for Australians to invest in it. That means the profits from these projects go to French shareholders. And the decisions about where to build and how to operate are made in Paris. That's not necessarily a problem. But it does mean that Australia's renewable revolution is being financed and controlled, in large part, by foreign capital. And that's a trend that's only going to continue. Because the amount of money needed to build all these projects is enormous. And Australian investors aren't always willing to take the risk. So foreign companies step in. And they bring their own agendas. They might prioritize projects that benefit their global portfolio, rather than what's best for Australia. So we need to keep an eye on that. But for now, Neoen is a key player. And they're just one of many foreign companies shaping Australia's energy future. Iberdrola didn't come to Australia to play small. This Spanish energy giant, one of the biggest utilities on the planet, has been buying up wind farms and solar projects like a collector snapping up rare stamps. And their prize jewel: the Port Augusta Renewable Energy Park in South Australia. That's where the old Playford B coal station once belched smoke, and now it's home to 210 megawatts of wind and solar, with a massive battery bolted on for good measure. But here's the thing that should make you sit up straight: Iberdrola isn't just building stuff and walking away. They're in it for the long haul, managing these assets for decades, which means they're not just investors, they're owners, with real control over how that power flows. And they're not alone. Ararat Wind Farm in Victoria, another 240 megawatts, all under their thumb. So when you flick a switch in Melbourne or Adelaide, there's a decent chance the electrons dancing through your wires were conjured by Spanish capital. And that's not a bad thing, necessarily. It's just a fact that's reshaping Australia's energy map, one wind turbine at a time. But here's the question nobody's asking: when a foreign giant owns the wind, who really owns the grid? And what happens if they decide to pack up and leave? We've taken you through the complex web of ownership behind Australia's electricity system, from the foreign-controlled giants to the Australian-owned stalwarts, from the massive transmission lines to the smallest remote community generator. Now, it's time to open the floor. We've received hundreds of questions from viewers across the country, and we're going to answer the most pressing ones, face to face. First up, if a foreign company owns an Australian power station, does that mean the electricity goes overseas? The answer is no. Electricity is consumed where it's generated, you can't export it on a ship. What leaves the country is the profit. When a company like Energy Australia, ultimately owned by CLP in Hong Kong, makes a return, that return is repatriated to shareholders abroad. That's not illegal, and it's not necessarily harmful, it's just how global capital works. But it does mean that every time you flick a switch, a portion of your bill may be funding infrastructure in another country. Another common question: why do we even allow foreign ownership of our critical infrastructure? The answer is capital. Australia's energy transition is projected to cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Our domestic savings, superannuation funds, government budgets simply can't cover it all. Foreign investment fills that gap. It brings not just money, but technology and expertise. The trade-off is control. And that's a decision Australians need to make consciously. A third question: can the government step in if a foreign owner acts against national interest? Yes. The Foreign Investment Review Board can impose conditions, and the government can force divestment in extreme cases. But that's a blunt tool, rarely used. The real protection is transparency, knowing who owns what, and holding them accountable. That's why documentaries like this matter. We've only scratched the surface. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into how you, as a consumer, can find out who powers your home and what you can do with that knowledge. Stay with us. And that brings us to the end of our investigation, but really, it's just the beginning of the conversation. Because now that we've laid out the facts, the ownership chains, the percentages, and the complexities, it's your turn. Your turn to ask the questions that matter. Your turn to look at your electricity bill and wonder where that money really goes. Your turn to question whether the decisions being made about Australia's energy future are being made with your interests at heart, or the interests of shareholders thousands of kilometers away. Your turn to decide if you're comfortable with foreign companies owning critical infrastructure, or if you think there should be more Australian control. Your turn to consider the role of government, of superannuation funds, of private investors, and of your own community in shaping what comes next. Because the truth is, the energy transition isn't just about technology or economics, it's about values. What kind of Australia do you want to live in? One where we control our own destiny, or one where we're dependent on others? There's no right or wrong answer, but there is a need for informed citizens to engage. So don't just accept what you're told. Do your own research. Ask your politicians the tough questions. Support policies that align with your values. And remember, every time you flick a switch, you're part of this story. The power is literally in your hands, and in your vote. So, what are you going to do about it? That's the question we leave with you. And now, we hand it over to you to continue the conversation. We've traced the wires back to the boardrooms, and now it's time to dig even deeper. Because ownership isn't just about who holds the shares, it's about who calls the shots when the grid is stressed, when prices spike, and when decisions about the future are made. Take a company like Energy Australia. CLP Holdings in Hong Kong owns it, but the day-to-day operations, the maintenance crews, the traders, the engineers, they're all Australians. So when we say foreign-owned, we need to ask, foreign-owned by whom, and with what level of control? Then there's the layered reality of joint ventures, like Gladstone Power Station, where Rio Tinto and NRG Energy each hold stakes but neither has full say. And what about the super funds? Australian Super and others hold significant positions in infrastructure like AUSNet, but they're not government-owned and they're not foreign, they're Australian institutions managing our retirement savings. The real deeper dive is into the contracts, power purchase agreements that lock in revenue for decades, and the offtake agreements that determine who actually benefits from the electrons generated. It's a web of financial engineering that makes simple labels like Australian or foreign almost meaningless. So as we move to the final chapters, keep this complexity in mind, because the answer to who owns Australia's power is not a single flag, but a mosaic of interests, and understanding that mosaic is the key to understanding our energy future.